Hi, I'm Whitney Espich, the CEO of the MIT Alumni Association, and I hope you enjoy this digital production created for alumni and friends like you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rick Lufkin, Chair of MIT's Cardinal and Gray Society. Welcome to the second in our three-part 2021 virtual spring speaker series. We will have one more program on April 28th, also at 1 p.m. Registration will open a couple of weeks prior to the date. You may wish to put this on your calendars now. As always, I extend an especially warm welcome to members of our companion organization, the Emma Rogers Society. Thank you for joining Cardinal and Gray members today and for your enduring support of the Institute. Please be assured that you will have the opportunity to submit questions to our presenter during his talk. Type them into the Q&A box on Zoom whenever they occur to you. We have allowed time on the schedule after the talk, and I will make every effort to ensure as many as possible get answered. Though we cannot be physically together, we are grateful to be connected. Adam J. Berinsky is the Mitsui Professor of Political Science at MIT and faculty affiliate at the Institute for Data, Systems, and Society, IDSS. He is a specialist in the fields of political behavior and public opinion. Professor Berinsky received his BA from Wesleyan University in 1992 and his doctorate from the University of Michigan in 2000. For the last decade, he has been studying political rumors and misinformation. Professor Berinsky has won several scholarly awards and is the recipient of multiple grants from the National Science Foundation. He is also the founding director of the MIT Political Experiments Research Lab. In 2016, he was appointed a John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation Fellow to study how political rumors spread and how can they be effectively debunked. Professor Berinsky has chosen as the title of his talk this afternoon, Rumors, Truths, and Reality, Political Misinformation in the Modern Day. I believe we can all agree with the need for such a discussion in today's charged climate, but also lament the necessity for such a discussion. Therefore, I now pass the virtual microphone to Professor Adam Berinsky.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm going to start sharing my screen. And good. Hopefully everyone can see that. Great. Well, this is it's really a pleasure to be able to speak to an alumni group. In the before times, I would often go around the country speaking to different alumni groups, and it's always been really fun for me to do that. I'm glad I have the opportunity to do that today. So today I'll be talking about some research that I've been doing over the last 10 years or so on political rumors and misinformation. I should say that everything that I'm going to be talking about today concerns rumors in the US. There's been certainly a big growth industry in that over the last few years, but there are important lessons for misinformation everywhere. I'm going to talk a little bit about some work that I've done with the Finnish government, but I really want to start where I got into this whole project, which was the summer of 2009. I had just gotten tenure. I was on sabbatical and I wanted to study a new project, and I thought it would be kind of interesting to study something I had seen in the air, which was kind of a resurgence of political rumors. So we're going to start here with, this is the thing that kind of sparked my interest. You might remember in the summer of 2009, there was sort of more talk about whether or not Barack Obama was a citizen, sorry. And what I have here is the first page of about 25 Wikipedia pages taken from that time about Barack Obama's citizenship. Now, you might recall this was questioned by many politicians, including our former president. And in the spring of 2011, after a couple of years of sort of trying to duck the issue, Obama released what was his long form birth certificate. Because what you see here is the computerized version, and some folks, notably Trump, said that they wanted to see the actual birth certificate. So in the spring of 2011, President Obama released this, which is a copy of his birth certificate, born in 1961 in Hawaii. Now, you might find this convincing, and Obama had hoped that this would put an end to discussion about rumors about his citizenship, but for some Americans, this wasn't enough. So if you were to investigate this, if you were to Google for example, Barack Obama birth certificate, you will see some people claim that this birth certificate uses a typeface that wasn't actually in use in 1961, or that twins born in the same hospital on the same day have a birth certificate that looks remarkably different from this. And so this, for me, this is fascinating, is that even with the presentation of evidence, these rumors persist. And that's what I've been trying to understand. Now, I should say off the bat that even though a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today are rumors among Republicans or on the right, that they have no monopoly on rumors in general. Like, so for example, going back to 2004, you might recall that there was some discussion after the election about the close election in Ohio. So Ohio had it flipped for Kerry by about 100,000 votes. He would have won the election with a minority of the popular vote. And in the wake of that, there was concern about some people, most notably, this is from a Rolling Stone story by Robert Kennedy, Jr., who made the claim that the election was stolen through voting machines that were used by Diebold. That this was one of the first elections. You might remember after the problems of the 2000 election, electronic voting machines were introduced in several locales, including Ohio. The ones in Ohio were designed by Diebold, but Diebold was also a donor to the Republican Party. So some on the left claimed that this was basically fraud, that the 2004 election was stolen. Now I'm going to be talking a lot about rumors in the modern day. And I'm not a huge fan of arguments that the internet changes everything. I think that a lot of the lessons that we can learn about rumors, we can go back to the founding days of the Republic. That in fact, a lot of the founding fathers were rumor mongers themselves, and so this is nothing new. But I do think what's new, and I want to talk a little bit about before I get into the subject of rumors, is thinking about how things are translated and how they spread through society. So I grew up in New York in the 1970s and 80s, and when I was growing up, this is how rumors were spread. So this was a picture of a sign that was on construction sites that basically claims that the reason that Walter Mondale lost the election to Ronald Reagan was not because he was a bad candidate or that Reagan won. It's because the Republicans and the Democrats got together and basically rigged the election for their nefarious purposes, right? So this is how rumors used to spread. Now in the age of Twitter and the age of the internet, to take you back to the night of the election, this week after the election, this is how rumors spread, right? Through presidential tweet. So this is a screenshot I took of Donald Trump's Twitter account before he took it down. But it's not just Trump; it's through a variety of actors on the internet spreading rumors. And so, so the modern media environment does look different. Now, I'm a scholar of political behavior. I primarily study the behavior and attitudes of the mass public, thinking about ordinary citizens. And so what I'm interested in is how does this rumor mongering affect how people respond to politics? And the answer seems to be that by and large, they're accepting these. So I'm going to show you here, this is a question I'm going to be referring to later. This was the other thing that got me interested in rumors in the summer of 2009 was controversy over the Affordable Care Act that Obama had proposed that was being considered by Congress. And there were rumors that there were death panels in here in that provision, right? So basically a required session to have with a doctor to decide when is it time to pull the plug. And so this is something that spread. It undermined the support for the Affordable Care Act and something I was very interested in. And so here in the summer of 2010, I ran a survey asking basically, do people actually believe these things? And so I asked, do you think the changes to the healthcare system that have been enacted by Congress, right? This was just a couple months after the ACA passed, and the Obama administration creates death panels, which have the authority to determine whether or not a gravely ill or injured person should receive healthcare based on their level of productivity in society. And what you're going to see here is a familiar pattern, right? So the good news is that a plurality of people reject this, right? So if you ask, do you think this is true? 46% say no. The bad news is that there's a chunk of people who accept it, 33% think it's true, and there's a bunch of people who say that they're not sure. And this is something I'm going to focus on as I'm talking through the talk, is that we really want to focus on these people who say that they're not sure. right? So it's not that these people necessarily haven't heard of that. It's just that they're unsure of whether or not this is supported. So I've done follow-up surveys where I ask questions like this, and then I ask folks after that, I ask, basically, why do you believe what you do? And a lot of the people who say not sure, when I ask them to follow up and sort of justify their position, it's not that they say like, oh, I haven't heard of this, or that's something, I just haven't thought much about. There's a lot of folks who essentially say, where there's smoke, there's fire. They'll say things like, well, I've heard a lot about death panels, so there must be something there. Or I've heard a lot about Obama's citizenship, right? Surely something fishy is going on. And that this is really damaging for the democratic process if you have a chunk of Americans who essentially say that they are not sure whether or not their president is a citizen, or they're not sure whether or not the government is enacting policies designed to kill older Americans. And again, this is true not just rumors on the right, among Republicans, among Democrats as well. So here, asked, do you think that people in the federal government either assisted in the 9/11 attacks or took no action to stop the attacks because they wanted the U.S. to go war in the Middle East? Here, again, there's a larger majority that reject it, 64%. But again, we have a chunk of folks who accept the rumor and another chunk of folks who say that they're not sure. And this is what I've been working on. This is I call it my soon-to-be forthcoming book. So one of my colleagues came up with that because they were tired of hearing me talk about the book that was going to come. I signed a contract to deliver in 2014. But the thing about rumors and misinformation over the last decade is that every time I think I'm getting close, there's something new. But I am actually finishing it up this year. And there's two central questions that I ask. So sort of as a scholar of political behavior, I want to know, how is it that reasonable people can come to believe bizarre stories about our political system and the politicians who run it? Now, obviously, not all these people are reasonable, but you don't get to a third of the American public without including some reasonable folks there. And then the second part is asking, how can we correct false information? Now, I should say that going into this project, I had high hopes that I would spend a year or so kind of digging in, trying to figure out why people believe these, and then a couple of years talking about solutions to correct that false information. And, unfortunately, I've come up with a lot more about the first question than the second question. I'm going to return to that at the end. That made some progress on correcting false information, but, as our current political climate shows us, there's still a lot more work to be done. So first, let me take that first question there and ask, why is it that people endorse rumors? Why do they say that they believe these seemingly fanciful stories? And there's two things that I want to talk about here. The first is a general tendency for conspiratorial thinking. And so this is just a general personality trait that social scientists, psychologists, political scientists have used different scales to measure this, but we know that some people are more likely to believe outlandish stories than others. So the example I always give is, think about your family holiday and think about sort of that cousin, that uncle, right? The one that you're always trying to avoid because they always have some sort of crazy story that they want to tell you. For me, that's my mother-in-law, and I'll return to her in a little bit. But thinking about that, there is this general tendency, regardless of your own beliefs, own political beliefs, sorry, to engage in conspiratorial thinking. Some people are high on this measure, some people are low. But where politics comes in is that we know that where people stand depends in large part on where they sit in this political environment. Sort of the easiest thing that I can do to predict how one voted in the last presidential election is to ask your partisanship, right? The percentage of Democrats who voted for Biden was over 90%. The percentage of Republicans who voted for Trump was well over 90% as well. This was not necessarily true 30, 40 years ago. There was more cross-party voting. But what we know today is that people are entrenched in their partisan beliefs. And there really is the power of partisanship. And so these two things come together, right? So it's not that all Republicans believe that Obama is not a citizen, but if you have a Republican who scores high on conspiratorial thinking, then they're more likely to say that Obama is not a citizen. Same is true with Democrats, right? If we were to ask about the 2004 election, do you think that Bush stole the election through fraud in Ohio? Not all Democrats agree with that statement, but Democrats who score high in conspiratorial thinking do agree with that statement. So let me show you, I'm just going to show you some data from the surveys I've collected that illustrate both these points. So on the first question, right, this question about general tendency to believe conspiracy theories, I've asked over time a battery of about 8 questions, basically asking, do you think that Obama was a citizen? Do you think that the 2004 election was rigged? Things like that, but also a nonpartisan rumor question, essentially asking, do you think that aliens landed in Roswell, right? And so the idea there is to get a sense of, who believes what. Is it structured by partisanship? Is there a general tendency? And what I found is, I'm going to show you these graphs here, is let me focus on rumor acceptance, which is on the left there. So of these 8 questions, on average, people endorse 2 of them, right? Now, you could say like, okay, that's a pretty high level, right? About, sort of a quarter of the scale of people endorsing these rumors. But what's notable to me is the skew. And you can see that there are not other, right? So it's not the case necessarily that there's a lot of people who believe a lot of crazy things, right? So if I go to the people who believe 7 out of the 8 rumors or more, it's a trivial number, right? It's just a fraction of a percent. But if I go the other way, and I look at the percentage of people who reject all these statements, it's under 30%, right? So over 70% of the American public will endorse one of these statements. So what I like to say, it's not that there's some people who believe a lot of crazy things. There's a lot of people who believe some crazy things. But partisanship also plays a big role. Like I said, I've been polling on this for about 10 years, and I've been asking a constant series of questions. And this data goes through 2018. There's the Obama birthplace rumor, the 9/11 rumor about sort of an inside job, the 2004 election fraud rumor that I mentioned, the Roswell. Do you think that aliens landed in Roswell? And then the last one is one I haven't talked about, but has become more prominent, is the notion that um, illegal immigrants, right? So these are illegal immigrants, people who come into this country unlawfully. When they come to this country, they're shown to a room where they have their choice of durable goods and cars. So like refrigerators, cars, washing machines that they can take with them in their new life in America. Now, obviously, this is an implausible story, but if you were to go Google this, you could find lots of discussion boards where people are talking about this. Um, and what I want to show here is that second part, the where you stand depends on where you sit. So here I'm showing the rumor rejection rates, right? So this is the question of basically how often do you say a rumor is false? And I'm showing a difference here between the percentage of Democrats and the percentage of Republicans. So things that are positive means that Democrats are more likely than Republicans to reject the rumors. Things that are negative means that Republicans are more likely to reject than Democrats. And in the middle of 0 means that there's no difference there. And what you can see is that the rumors about Democrats cluster up top. On the question of Obama's birthplace, there's a 60-point gap. On election fraud, there's a 60-point gap going the other way, where Republicans are much more likely to reject. But on things that are not necessarily non-political, right? After all, so the rumor that aliens landed in Roswell and the government is trying to hide it is an anti-government rumor, but it's not a partisan rumor. And so we can see there is that there really aren't differences between Democrats and Republicans. Okay, so having set the stage, I'll get to the next question, which is kind of what got me into this in the first place, is how can we actually correct these rumors? And it's really hard. I've given talks to different groups. I've talked to government officials in Finland. I gave a talk after the 2016 election to the Democratic Congressional Caucus. I've talked to different tech companies. And every time I go there, I say, I know that you brought me here because you want me to say, here's the 4 easy things that you need to do to fix the misinformation problem. And I tell people, like, it's not possible. And anyone who tells you that it is a snake oil salesman, and you should run away. And that this is an argument that was, sort of, it's a lot. people are a lot more accepting of this argument today than they were back when I started this project. Sort of saying, what's the secret sauce? What's the magic bullet? And I think it's pretty clear after what's happened over the last few years in American politics that this is not the case, right? That we know that rumors are sticky. And so what I argue is that we want to use kind of credible sources. And so here it's not so much the argument that's being made, but who's making the argument. And what I argue is that we want to use partisanship as a weapon against misinformation. And so I'm gonna dive into some experimental results that I have. But before I do that, I want to show you a clip, and hopefully this will work. That actually, this is a really nice 90-second clip that shows kind of the work I've done and gives the argument, and then I'll show you the data that I've run.
I went to MIT to meet with an expert on disinformation and fake news, Adam Berinsky.
In the previous eras, you could turn to the media as the trusted source, right? Think about it in a basketball game. It's a referee, right? Someone
Doesn't
who
help me,
says,
sorry.
okay,
Can you
so
do cricket?
I actually can't do cricket, but let's try
Rugby?
do they have a referee in rugby?
I don't know, I don't watch it.
Well, I guess the problem in today is that there is no independent referee, right? So you can get thinking about death panels, right? That there's this notion that...
Oh no, I know what death panels are. Yeah, we have them in England, so it's like a pretty small price to pay for free healthcare.
So we actually don't have death panels here.
Good for you.
And these nonpartisan organizations, they said these aren't true, but those kinds of corrections just didn't stick. So instead, what works is if you have people speaking against their apparent interest, right? So having a Republican saying that death panels are false, that's the most effective.
We found the cure!
So it's an easy cure, hard to implement though.
So there is a cure, but the cure does not work.
Not always.
Adam, why am I even here?
Okay, good. So, I mean, to kind of dig into that argument a little bit more, and so that basically, in order to correct rumors, we need to have facts. So, sort of what I'm going to be talking about, though, is how can we best deliver those facts? So I think it's great that we have organizations that engage in fact checking, right? We need someone to determine what is the ground truth on a particular matter, but it's not the case necessarily that those people are the best person to deliver the message, right? So here's another story about my mother-in-law, which is that it used to be that she would send me chain emails, right? She's she's not on Facebook or social media. She'd send me chain emails, and I would say, no, KT, it's not the case that Obama has 64 different social security numbers or that he was born in Kenya. Here's a link to a site from Snopes.com or factcheck.org that lays out the evidence that isn't the case. And that worked for a while, but eventually she said to me, she was like, Adam, you keep saying that, sending me to these sites, but all my conservative friends tell me it's just liberal garbage, so I'm not going to believe it, right? And so the thing is that we want to have fact checkers, but we need to think about who's the best person to deliver that message. And my argument is that it's an unlikely source. So thinking of the example I like to use sometimes is thinking about McDonald's and French fries. So there was a time that McDonald's sold supersized French fries, which is essentially two large fries put together. And at some point in the 1990s, they stopped selling it. Now, you can create your own supersized fries if you'd like, buying two large fries. So they're not preventing you from doing that. But if a company that makes its money selling French fries no longer sells a supersize of fries, that is probably a pretty good signal that you should not be eating so many French fries, right? And so thinking about this unlikely source, right? Who's speaking against their apparent interest? And in the case of death panels, that was Republicans. So what I'm going to show you here is the results of an experiment that I ran where I had 5 different treatments. So basically, I showed people different kinds of information. I had a control group where I showed them nothing. And then I had 4 different treatments. So they were randomized either into the control group or one of these 4 conditions. And here I'm just going to highlight right? These highlights were not on the things that they actually read, but I just want to highlight the information here. You can see here I'm presenting just the rumor, and I have the ambiguity, right? In the headline, will there be death panels? And I have some money quotes here from Betsy McConaughey, for example, former lieutenant governor of New York State, who said that the bill has provisions that make it mandatory that people in Medicare have a required counseling session that will tell them how to end their life sooner. Chuck Grassley says you have every right to fear. You should not have a government-run plan to decide when to pull the plug on grandma. Now, right, so these are things that would lead people to be suspicious of the Affordable Care Act, should undermine support. So another quick mother-in-law story, right, that for most people you'd think this would decline support, but it turns out she actually supported the ACA because she thought that there would be death panels. And I don't know if she had particular people in mind, but that is an unusual reaction, right? Normally this is the undermining of authority. Then move to where I have the correction, right? So this is what we do in a standard sense, is bring in the experts, right? Bring in people from the American Medical Association, bring in folks from the AARP to say, these are just not true, right? And so here, this should do better than just the rumor, but the question is, can we do better still? And I argue that we could by having a Republican come and correct it, right? So again, someone speaking against their apparent interest. And so here I use John Isaacson, who's a Republican senator from Georgia. He was one of the co-authors of these provisions, so he had a personal stake in it. But of course, the Republican Party did not. That they were opposed to the ACA, and they, sort of we seen in the history of healthcare reform over since the ACA was passed, Republicans attacking the bill. So if you have a Republican, even if it's in their personal interest to do so, it's not in the party's interest, right? And so there they become a credible source. And Isaacson basically says, like, Sarah Palin was talking about it. That's nuts. This is just not true. And then just to kind of see, like, does having a politician do that? I have a similar thing with a Democrat. And so my argument was that the most effective correction, the thing that was going to most move people's minds, was having that Republican. And so I'm going to show you is the results of an experiment where I ran, where again, I randomized people into one of these 5 groups, a control group or 4 other groups. And with that, afterwards, after they read that, I had them answer a question, basically, do you think that there are death panels? Do you think that the ACA requires euthanasia discussion? And so I did this 2 times. I did this right after they read the article, but I was also interested in learning about the persistence of information. That basically, can I correct it and move on? So think about what Obama tried to do with with the questions of his citizenship. He basically said, here's the birth certificate. Now we're done with this. Let's move on. And does that stick? And actually, I'm happy to talk about this in the Q&A. I have some work that suggests that on the death panels, it didn't stick, that people sort of accepted it in the moment, but over time, the effect of that information decayed. So let me just show you here. This is sort of the last slide of my results, to show you basically, so this is a question where the columns are these different conditions. So remember, people are randomized into one of these 5 conditions: the control where they get nothing, the rumor only, the rumor and the nonpartisan correction, the rumor and the Republican correction, and the rumor and the Democratic correction. And what I want you to focus on, again, is this rumor rejection rate. For 2 reasons, right? Because that's sort of the normative standard, but also recall what I said about the not sures, right? That, if we look at that first row, we see there's not a lot of difference in the people who believe this, that either people believe it, or they're not sure, or they don't believe it. And the people who do believe it, it's very hard to move. However, we can move people in and out of this not sure category, right? We can get people who are expressing doubt to express no doubt, to say, no, I reject this rumor. So the control, right? So this is where they get no information, 58% reject it. If I present to you just the rumor, 43% reject it, right? So basically giving people bad information makes them less likely to reject the rumor. If I give them the rumor and correction, though, I'm back to the control, right? So basically giving them the rumor and the nonpartisan correction is equivalent to giving them nothing at all, right? So we're basically back where we started. The only case where we can do better is where we have the Republican correct that, right? So here, 68% of people in that condition rejected the rumor, right? If I give you that rumor and that quote from John Isaacson, you're likely to reject it. So this is the, I guess, this isn't a very happy talk. I don't really have many happy stories, but to the extent there is, it is that people are receptive to information from unlikely sources. So that's the good news. The bad news is that doesn't last very long, right? So I went to these same people 2 weeks later, and you can see in the control condition, there's no difference, right? So that's from a scientific standpoint, that's good, right? That if nothing happened to you, then things remain the same. That's a kind of a stable baseline. But then that's where the good news, the top part is where the good news ends. Because if I presented you with the rumor only, that's stuck, right? 2 weeks later, you're back where you started. I'm sorry, below where you started, right? That you're more likely to say not sure than people in the control condition. But if you look at all these correction conditions, they all fade by about 7 to 10%. And in the case of the rumor and the nonpartisan correction, at the time, it's puts you back in the control, right? So basically, the good and bad information cancels out. But 2 weeks later, things are even worse. And so, that's sort of where I am with this, is saying there are things we can do, but there's no magic bullet, and that corrections don't last very long. But so that leads me to kind of the work that I've been doing since then, is basically thinking about ways that we can sort of, in light of this, in light of how difficult a problem this is, what can we do to try to solve this? And I'm just going to just sort of briefly for a minute or two talk about this. I'm happy to talk more about this in the Q&A, but I didn't want to present a whole lot more work. But a lot of the work I've been doing is at the intersection of cognitive science and political science. And so David Rand, who is a psychologist who's in the business school, he and I have been working together on different ways that perhaps we could get people to think more deeply about the information that they possess, and think about whether or not they should hold on to rumors. And so one thing that we've been doing is testing cognitive nudges, right? So essentially getting people to think twice before they share something on Twitter or share something on Facebook, by essentially reminding them that they don't want to share false information, right? So basically, it's using what David and his co-author Gordon Pennycook have called an accuracy nudge. And we've been doing this and work with different technology companies. We've been working with Jigsaw, which is a sort of the R&D arm of Google, on ways that we could employ accuracy nudges to get people to behave better in search, or better when they're using YouTube. And there's a couple things that are coming out of that that's really exciting. Dave and I are also going to be working with Twitter, and some products involving the crowdsourcing of misinformation, right? So basically, how can we get information to kind of these corrections out? And lastly, we've also been doing some work with Facebook. So for me, this is really exciting, is not just doing the basic science, but also employing kind of thinking about how we can get these solutions so that they're scaled up by tech companies. And then finally, there's a group of us in IDSS, right, that is looking at the intersection of computer science and social science there. And so this is, I said, like, the last few years have been bad for democracy, but good for the social science business. And so for me, that's been a really exciting way to think about that. And so that's what I have, and I'm happy now to turn it over. So I just do my stop share.
Thank you, Professor Berinsky. I once read that the founding fathers had a profound distrust for human nature. I think everything I've heard today confirms that distrust. We do have a number of questions. Let me go ahead, and I will express the question, and I'll let you in real time respond as appropriate. In these days of increasing Increasingly realistic digital fakes and deep fakes. I think this is responding to the birth certificate issue. Is it ever possible to produce convincing evidence for or against anything?
Mhm. Yeah, no. So this this is so I'm not a philosopher. We have a terrific philosophy department at MIT, but it's hard to approach this without thinking about the meaning of truth. And so this is something I've struggled with to try to figure. It's like basically, at what point can we say that something is proven? And we can't, right? So thinking about the Watergate conspiracy, for example, right? The break-in of the Democratic National Committee was a conspiracy. It was a rumor until it wasn't, right? And so, right, we can never definitively say that this is false. But what we can do is look at the balance of available evidence in a free society. And so I think that that's kind of what's different about the U.S. compared to some other countries is the free flow of information. And to think, given the publicly available evidence at the time. Publicly doesn't just have to be, sort of what government releases. It can be investigative reporting. That we can say, would a reasonable person believe that this has a standard, is proven by a standard of evidence or supported by a standard of evidence. So, I don't want to go fully postmodern and say, we cannot say what is true and what is false. But I think that we need to think about what is supported by evidence and what is not supported by evidence. So Obama's birth certificate, for example, right, to that if you think he wasn't a citizen, you need to not only believe that the birth certificate was faked, but you need to believe that someone back in 1961 put a birth announcement in a Hawaiian newspaper under the assumption that in 40 years an African American would run for president and win, right? So I think again it's this sort of, in a lot of these kind of conspiracy theories, people often ask me about QAnon. I know that that's something that's gotten a lot of play, and it's a lot of time it's just sort of chasing the same rumor over and over again, where you present evidence, they say yes, but, and so I think at some point we just need to say, is this supported by the balance of publicly available evidence, and say, okay, that is the truth. Now, my colleagues in philosophy, might have different beliefs, and I think that that's right. But sort of as an empirical social scientist, that's the standard that I'm using.
One wishes that common sense were more common. Uh, Next question is, why is the GOP so much more successful than the Democrats in framing bogus information? That is, death panels or death taxes.
Yeah. So I mean, this is an interesting question, and it's a very tricky question politically. So I should say that so in addition to the work I've done with Facebook, I spent some time as a contractor working for Facebook on their misinformation team. And I think that one thing that is really hard to convey is the fact that there is an imbalance in the distribution of misinformation in the environment between the left and the right. Right. And so this is not a political view, right? This is not saying, it gets very tricky to talk about, right? Even in this group, it's going to be very tricky to talk about. Is that saying it is an empirical fact that there is more misinformation on the right than the left? And so there's a group at Harvard through the Shorenstein Center, and it's also the law school, that has done basically trying to map the misinformation system and sort of seeing, where do these false news sources or these kind of highly partisan news sources come from. And what they find is that there's a huge span across the spectrum, but what's missing in terms of the overall valence of news sources, regardless of whether or not things are true or false, that there is really no center right news outlet there. That there's kind of moderate left, there's some center, there's some far right, and I think that kind of system sort of incentivizes not just necessarily politicians, but people who are purveying information to kind of display that. So to kind of circle back to what makes this tricky is that any sort of intervention where you're trying to balance the outcome, where it's like basically, let's say, okay, there's fake news on both the left and the right, there's misinformation on both the left and the right. Why don't we just chop off, sort of the top 100 sources on each side, right? Kind of these are the most misinformation. And the thing is that that's not going to give you an equality of result. And it's unfortunate, because we're thinking if we want to have even-handed interventions, like we don't want to tilt the scales against one party or the other, right? And that's how autocracies rise. That's what's going on in places like Myanmar, right? We don't want that, but at the same time, we do need to recognize that empirically, and this is true, sort of there's really good social science work that shows that there is this imbalance. And so what I would say is it's not so much that Republicans are better or worse or Democrats are better or worse, but there is something about the current media ecosystem and kind of the incentives for publishers and for politicians that rewards it more on the left than rewards it more on the right than the left. So I don't know why that is, but it is definitely something that we need to recognize and account for.
Another attendee asks, how have our movies and books about spies and security with the use of altered identities, events, and knowledge affected acceptance of conspiracy theories by many people?
Right, so that's an interesting question. So I haven't done this work myself, but there are social scientists who look at the effect of fictionalization on people's attitudes. Like, for example, there's a study done, the show 24, that was popular about sort of a decade, oh, actually now it's 2 decades ago. So yeah, I'm getting older. But sort of like in the around 2001, 2003, they found that exposure to that experimentally increased people's support for using torture, right? And so kind of like basically you show it's effective on screen, people are more likely to support that. So a similar argument could be made about conspiracy theories, right? The kind of, all the conspiracy movies of the 1970s, sort of there's a resurgence of those, right? Does that feed into it? The answer is that it could be, but in part, I think the culture reflects kind of the interest of society at the time. So it could be a cause, it could be effect. But I think that the biggest thing to recognize is that, that in thinking, this got me thinking about the first question was asking about deep fakes and such, is that it's not, sort of people ask me, do I think that deep fakes, mean the end of society, right? So that we can't tell anything that's true or false. And what I say is that, deep fakes are just the latest round of technology where, for 100 years, we've had the ability to have altered photographs, right? Even before Photoshop, right? And so, right, nothing is new under the sun here. So I think what I would say is that maybe you should be as worried about conspiracy theory movies as you are about deepfakes if you're worried about kind of people's willingness to believe that. And that's not to minimize the potential problem of deepfakes, but to recognize that all these tools have been around for decades, centuries, and that there is nothing new here. Sort of the kind of what's new is the scope of how easy it is for people to find people like themselves, and how easy it is to kind of to spread misinformation. But the actual processes are very old and reflect not just this country but other countries as well. I gave a talk to a group of Spanish sociologists about a year ago talking about this, and they said, "You're like, oh, you think that's crazy? Let me tell you some stories from back in our country." And this is true wherever I go.
Yeah. Another member asks, what about the influence of biased media? Do you see any way to get accurate news and information from print and electronic media?
So that's it. So it's so another line of work that I'm working on is about basically media self-selection effects, and so this is a separate line of work. I guess so the modern political environment has given me a lot to chew on. But one of these, so essentially the question that we're asking in that project, and this was a National Science Foundation grant that I got with Tepe Yamamoto, who's one of my colleagues, that we're wrapping up now. Is the question, like, do people become conservative because they watch Fox News, or do they watch Fox News because they're conservative, right? And so the question is, do I select the media I want, or do I learn from the media that I just happen to watch? And the answer is surely a little bit of both, right? The conservatives tend to congregate to Fox News, liberals to MSNBC, but there is a little persuasion as well. So what I would say, though, is that, thinking about this is that there we're looking at the extremes. The other thing that, and this gets back to the role of these don't knows that I was talking about, is, what I tell my students, and what I'll tell you is that, um, most of the people most of the time don't care about politics. So the students in my class, I tell them, like, you're unusual. You're here because you want to learn about politics. Just as everyone who came to this talk today is unusual in that they wanted to hear about misinformation, that they wanted to learn about politics. Most of the people just don't care. They want to tune it out. So, this question of people seeking out information that fits their world beliefs, that's true, but only at the extremes, right? And so what we do want to worry about is not so much, sort of Fox News persuading kind of Republicans to go further down the rabbit hole, or MSNBC getting Democrats to go further down the rabbit hole. What we want to think about is these people in the middle who just are basically incidentally exposed to news, right? That they're not seeking it out. But if you look at social media, and I use Facebook a lot, not just because I used to work there, but because it's a fun way to keep in touch with folks. I do it because I want to see pictures of my friends' kids, and I want to see like funny videos that will make me laugh. But at the same time, I'm plugged into social networks where I'm incidentally exposed to news. Sort of someone posts like, I can't believe this is happening, or can you believe that the Republicans did this, or I can't believe the liberals are canceling this person, right? And so that incidental exposure could affect people. So I think what I would say is I wouldn't worry so much about sort of the kind of biased news sources leading people down these rabbit holes, but the fact that kind of this incidental exposure to people who aren't paying a lot of attention to news, and realistically, we shouldn't expect them to, right? That I tell people most of the people most of the time don't pay attention to politics, not because they're not sort of not smart or they're not engaged, but people have a lot going on in their lives, right? That politics for most people is a sideshow, and so what I worry about is for the people who it is a sideshow, if they can get exposed to this kind of incidental exposure. So if you have, like someone like my mother-in-law or your crazy uncle or your crazy cousin, right, who's spewing this, if you don't pay attention, you might still take some of that in. And that's kind of that's what I'm really worried about, kind of undermining the environment. And so that's where you get the case of people who, when they say, I'm not sure if Obama's a citizen, they're like, well, where there's smoke, there's fire. I hear a lot about this, right? If what you hear is this, sort of glancing past your cousin's Facebook feed and seeing stuff about that, then that's potentially very dangerous.
You evidently have an excellent relationship with your mother-in-law. I commend you for it.
It's it's good. It's funny, on that Samantha Bee show, when I was doing, so they filmed 3 hours to get the 90 seconds that they showed there. And I said, well, like, what should I do? And then the interviewer said, do not try to be funny. No matter what you do, do not try to be funny, because it always is off. Right. And so like, okay, so basically, as you saw there, I played the straight person. And at one point, I wanted to start telling the story about my mother-in-law, because she is a frequent character in my talks. And these are all true, I should say. And people ask me, does my mother-in-law know I tell these stories? And I say, well, she doesn't, but my wife does, so that's okay. But it's sort of that the interviewer, I started saying, well, let me tell you about the story about my mother-in-law. She's like, is this a joke? Like, you don't want to do jokes? I'm like, no, it's true. But I think it is, I do. It is, she is emblematic of a certain kind of person who is tangentially engaged with politics, but has a lot of free time on her hands, and basically sort of is incidentally exposed to these things. But I did tell that, but luckily, I thought that there was no way that she was actually going to watch that Samantha Bee clip. It turns out she did, but they didn't use it, so I got off okay.
One of our people asks, how do your polls assure a statistically significant representative sample of the U.S. population?
Okay, yeah, no, so that's a great question. So I have another talk. So I was saying that I give talks to alumni groups, and typically what I talk about are election polls and polling more generally. So that's another specialty of mine, is thinking about basically think about survey research. So, I can talk about that for an hour. Um, or let me talk about for sort of 30 seconds is I basically, sort of trust me that I'm using the best technology that we can to get representative samples of Americans. But this is definitely something that I would be concerned about. And so it's a great question, and I'm happy to send along my slide deck that I do on this. But maybe I'll spare. I think that we have another 10 minutes left, so I will spare that so I could take
Yeah.
up questions.
Um, any promise to the idea of teaching critical thinking in schools?
Yeah, I mean, so
Whole
this is
different angle.
yeah. Now this is interesting. But so the I mentioned that the Finnish government that I've worked with, that came about because this was in 2015. They were worried about rumors coming from Russia, and so I first learned about Russia Today in 2015. Right, they talked about kind of the misinformation because they have a lot of Russian nationals in Finland. People who are born in Russia who live there. There's obviously a long history between Russia and Finland of non-cooperation, and so they were basically looking like basically how can we deal with this? And they created a system, basically media literacy in schools, right? And so, so if you read reporting about it, they say this was a great success. And so that sort of, I want to be careful here because I think that they did do a good job, but the question is like how translatable is that to other countries? So Finland is a very homogenous country. Sort of the kind of the misinformation from Russia was so damaging because it was sort of it was an outside influence trying to divide a society. In the U.S we're not so homogenous, so I think the question is were they able to do this because there were kind of common views about what truth is, what falsehood is, and so what I would say is it's teaching critical thinking could be good, but just because it's worked in Finland doesn't mean it's going to work here. And on the other thing I would say is that, critical thinking can go, can take you too far, right? So we teach you to be critical of what you read, and that's one pathway into conspiracy theories there. So, again, it gets at there's no easy solution here. Sort of, there's a bunch of different groups. So, Dave Rand and I are working on these accuracy nudges. I've my shtick is what I showed you about so the information coming from sources speaking against their apparent interest, right? So these are all good, sort of let a thousand flowers bloom, but there's no magic bullet. And so I think a lot of the folks who are making the argument that we need to kind of fix the education system are looking for a magic bullet that I think doesn't exist. I think better we look for a lot of different strategies that might be able to work. Yeah, I'm sorry. That's a little bit of a rant, but I get asked this a lot, and I just wanted to sort of make sure say that I think that if people just take one thing from my talk today, my hope is like, wow, that's a big problem. There aren't easy solutions, so let's think about a lot of different solutions that maybe throw a bunch of stuff up against the wall, and hopefully some will stick.
Thank you. Why does misinformation travel faster than accurate information?
Okay. So this is so there was I don't know if this refers to there was a really nice study done out of MIT a couple of years ago by Deb Roy and Snell where they basically said fake news travels faster than truth. So I think partially I think that they classified this, and you could say empirically they showed it as the case. But I think part of it is the kind of the characteristics of these. Like true news is boring. It's like in a lot of ways. Fake news is novel. It's exciting. It stimulates emotion. So I think it's not so much the nature of whether something is true or false, but thinking about the characteristics of the news, right? So for me to say, Obama's a legitimate president because he was born in the U.S. is not as exciting as like, have you heard that there's a suspicion about his birth certificate? So I think again, I think the important thing to do is not so much to focus on true or false, but thinking about kind of the characteristics of that news. And so, one solution is let's make true news more exciting, right? Sort of make the true more exciting, right? So, it's not about the veracity of the information per se, it's about other characteristics. So, thinking about how we can package this, I think that's what I would say.
Fascinating. There's a long question, but I think I can chew on it here. You say that people have always believed in rumors and conspiracies. Has the proportion of people who believe in these things changed significantly in the recent past, or is it about the same as 50 or 200 years ago? Are the people who tend to believe misinformation and rumors different from those who don't in terms of education, socioeconomic backgrounds, race, religion, or other factors?
Yeah, I mean, those are great
Mouthful.
questions.
Yeah.
So let me answer the second one first. Is when we think about who has this tendency toward conspiratorial thinking, um, there is an education role, right? So if I was to run a regression where I predict whether or not people are like this, so that men are more likely to believe than women, lower educated are more likely than high educated, but that it doesn't explain a lot of the variance there. So a lot of it is about sort of psychological state, and so this is sort of psychologists have looked at things like sort of how comfortable are you with uncertainty, right? And people who are not comfortable with uncertainty are more likely to believe conspiracy theories because it gives more order to the world. So I think that what I would say is that these things are predictable to a point, and a lot of them have to do with differences in the psychological background of it. I mean, here I don't mean so my wife is a clinical psychologist, so like these are not things that she would diagnose, but think about more as a personality kind of type, that certain people are more likely to believe things than others. On the first question, this is an excellent question. And to a certain degree, I can't answer that because opinion polling didn't start until the 1930s. And the first real sort of thinking about around the communism in the 1950s, there were a few questions, but people didn't really start asking about conspiracy theories until after the JFK assassination, right? That kind of thing. So partially it's I don't have the data, but there's other things I can look at. So there's a group of scholars that have tried to do this by looking at the letters to the editor of the New York Times over the last 100 years there. And right, and so not saying that that's not necessarily representative of the full population, but it's something that's constant, right? In that people choose to write in their opinions to the editor. It's a way to look over time. And they find that, things like the 1950s were actually higher in conspiratorial thinking than today, right? So around anti-communism and McCarthyism, and sort of in the World War I era as well. You might remember, sort of from your history books that there was a lot of worry about foreign nationals, right? And the sort of like Germans, Italians, kind of being kind of against America, right? And so, this is sort of the banning of the word kindergarten, like no one can have sauerkraut, right? That these were kind of highlights of conspiratorial thinking there. And so, it feels really big to us now. And I think in part it's because of this ease of spread, right? That you don't need to look at the posters on the side of wall construction sites like I did when I was a kid. All right, you can just flip on the internet and you'll see this. But it is something that has been a constant, and it's constant across countries as well, as I mentioned. Right, it's not just here, but it's other places. So it is nothing new. It just feels bigger than it is. And I think what's nice is that I could tell you over the last 10 years, it might feel like it's getting bigger, but it's not really, right? So the kind of if I show you time trends of all these different questions that I've asked, they remain fairly flat.
We're close to a wrap. Let me lay two more on you. What does your research say about heavily financed rumors versus more naturally occurring ones?
So that's an interesting question, right? Which is kind of think about like, how do you amp the volume, right? And there's different ways. That's why I think about this question is thinking about finances. There's different ways, right? That there's, think about QAnon, for example, right? This is something that has spread fairly widely, and knowledge of QAnon, sort of this, for those of you who don't know, right, it's kind of this bundle of conspiracy theories involving, sort of that Democratic politicians, I think, are sucking the blood of babies, and involved in human trafficking, uh, all sorts of things, right? And the question is, why does that gain traction, right? So it might gain traction because you have these groups that can find each other on things like Reddit, where kind of it spread, groups on Facebook. It's also something that was picked up by the media, right? And so, if the New York Times is running articles about QAnon, people are more likely to hear about it. So, the question, if the question is, are there different ways that one could kind of foster the spread of rumors, the answer is yes, right? And so, that can think about, sort of, think grassroots organization versus astroturfing, right, which is someone paying money to get that out there. But I would say I would expand beyond that, just to think about there's many pathways by which rumors can get a hold of the public imagination and spread through the media ecosystem.
Let me close with a question perhaps inspired by your credential as the founding director of the MIT Political Experiments Research Lab. We are asked, have you ever deliberately started a rumor?
Deliberate start a rumor? Not in my professional capacity as a
Okay.
researcher.
Thank you.
Maybe in middle school I did, but no, I mean, I think that this is a lot of there's kind of it's a good note to end on. This kind of think of a serious question is, in some ways this is a very difficult topic to study because I don't have control over rumors. So the experiments I showed you today, I did about rumors that were in circulation in the political world, right? Everything in the treatments that I showed you came from actual news articles. And so, if I really want to control, if I want to see, like, does fake news spread faster than true news, I would try to spread fake news or true news. Now, I'm on the MIT Human Subjects Committee, and so I can say that we would never allow something like that. But even if we did, it's not an ethical way of doing research. So, I think that there's some that basically, just because we can find the answers to some questions doesn't mean we should. But that said, I think that there's enough going on in the real world that I can tap into, that we can learn a lot. And hopefully I've been able to show you some of that today.
Thank you. I believe we have now exhausted our time horizon. Professor Adam Berinsky, thank you very, very much for your time this afternoon. As always, the opportunity to listening to an MIT professor who sort of by definition has an articulate level of insight into thorny issues is what makes this experience so worthwhile, and why we of the Cardinal and Gray Society really appreciate your time and your effort. Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining us. And for more information on how to connect with the MIT Alumni Association, please visit our website.